Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this evening. It's really great to have you along for our first event of the Festival of Debate. My name is Johnny, and I'm from Opus Independence, the social enterprise behind the Festival of Debate. Festival programme this year runs from today, the 13th of April, to the 26th of May, and includes over 70 events, 150 speakers, and 50 partners. The festival looks to explore the entangled ecological, economic, and political crisis we collectively face. There are no easy answers, but we hope the festival creates a space to explore and hold complexity and uncertainty, and brings together a community of people to make change where they are. Most events are free at the point of access, and where we do need to charge a ticket fee, those prices are kept as low as we possibly can. If you would like to make a donation to the Festival of Debate because you enjoyed this evening or would like to support the work we're doing, I will post a link in for the website festivalofdebate.com into the chat, so you can do so if you are in a position and able to. But otherwise, I will just be in the background for this evening. If you do have any questions, you can bob me a message and I will endeavour to help with that. But otherwise, I will hand over to your host for the evening, Aaron.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Johnny. I'll also be in the background for most of this evening. Firstly, to introduce myself, my name's Aaron, and I work for Hope for the Future. We're a climate communications and democratic engagement charity nationwide, but kind of head office in Sheffield. I will shortly be handing over to Alex, who will be the chair for the panel discussion today. But just before that, to say if you've got any tech issues or any questions, please drop myself or Johnny a message over Zoom, and we'll kind of endeavour to get back to that. And also we have a Q&A section after the discussion topics. So please do feel free to use the Q&A function on the Zoom webinar, and I will do my absolute best to kind of collate them ready for the Q&A at the end. But without further ado, I will hand over to Alex.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Yes, wonderful to be here. My name is Alex Hensby. I'm a lecturer in sociology at the University of Kent, and I am the co-director for the Centre for the Study of Social and Political Movements. I apologise for the echo. I'm in a large seminar room in Manchester at the moment. But I'm going to introduce our three fantastic panellists, starting with Clare Farrell, who is the co-founder of the environmental action group Extinction Rebellion. She's also a fashion designer by trade, with previous activist experience rooted in artistic practice. And she also played a significant role in developing XR's powerful image and aesthetic. Second, we have Sarah Jordan, and Sarah is the director for Hope for the Future, which is a climate communications charity which has been working to equip communities, groups, and individuals across the country to communicate the urgency of climate change to the local politicians for the last 10 years. Their training helps decode the complexities of local government structures and advises on how to develop common ground with politicians and advance a progressive agenda. And finally, we have Chantelle Lunt, who is a writer, educator, entrepreneur, and founder of Merseyside BLM Alliance, a co-founder of Reclaim Pride Liverpool, and co-chair of United We Stand Solidarity Network. Chantelle is also the chair of the Merseyside Alliance for Racial Equity, CIC, which is a non-profit organisation committed to promoting racial equality across Merseyside through grassroots community-led work, including community education, youth engagement, and training. So we've got some themes that we're going to discuss, but I think what might be quite a good way to start is to think about the different ways in which everybody contributes to advancing social justice, and actually the biographical ways in which we have come to get involved in this work. So I'd like to start with Chantelle, and if Chantelle could explain how you became politicized, what your kind of activist story is, and if indeed you identify as an activist, and at what point in time that you felt like the term activist may or may not feel part of your identity?
Hey, yeah, I think you can hear me. Just give me a nod if you can. Amazing. So I think I have quite a unique story of my kind of journey into activism, and I think during my journey into activism and a lot of my experiences in activist spaces, my kinds of ideas of what an activist is changed, because I'm quite well known for being, you know, a civil rights activist, an environmental activist, an LGBTQ plus ally, and for sort of being on the streets with a megaphone and campaigning about the issues that matter to me, mostly BLM, the wave of BLM 2020. And I think so for me, I'd often associated my activism with holding a megaphone and kind of being in street spaces and doing quite visible campaign work. But the more I think about it, activism is a lot of background stuff, but it's also, it can occur in any space, in professional settings, in community settings, in organisations, and in any time and place. And so I became really sort of strong in my views and in my commitments wanted to do something against systemic racism, particularly that perpetrated by the police, after my own experiences as a police officer. Experiences of, you know, institutional racism and sexism that have dominated headlines. You know, I've had quite in-depth first-hand experiences of that. And so one of my first experiences of really standing up for what was right and really challenging an issue that I knew was wrong before it was in the papers, before it was really a mainstream conversation, was when I was in a police uniform, standing in the office of superior officers saying, you have a serious issue with racism and misogyny and you need to address this issue. And I feel like as someone within an organisation standing up on your own in a room full of people who are gaslighting you, fighting a battle that at that time for me seemed so much bigger than who I was. You know, I was being told things like, if you go up against the police force, they'll become a force against you. And that's really how I felt. I feel like standing up for something, even if you're not sure that you can win it, and standing up and just standing in your truth because you know what you're fighting against is wrong, that is activism. So there's activists everywhere. There's people, and over the past 3 years, you know, I've met people who do incredible things in workspaces, people who do brilliant things at a community and grassroots level, you know, people who are fighting for better health and people who are fighting for the right to food, you know, such a basic right in Western society, fighting for everyone, working class people. And they wouldn't always consider themselves or describe themselves as activists because they don't stand on the street with a megaphone, but what they're doing is incredibly powerful and what they're doing is activism. So my kind of trajectory went from being in a workspace and not getting anywhere with addressing this issue to moving onto the streets with a megaphone and just kind of shouting and fighting and doing everything I could to highlight this issue. And now we're in a space where conversations about institutional racism, institutional misogyny and institutional homophobia are really, really, really mainstream. I think I am in quite a point of reflection about not just the work that I've done, but the work that hundreds of thousands of people and generations that have come before me, most notably people from the civil rights movement, have done to expose the practices within policing. So I think activism exists in a lot of spaces and in a lot of places, but for me the three most significant spaces where, you know, change often happens are in political spaces, in, you know, activist spaces like politics of the street, because that's still a political space, but then also in workspaces, you know, through trade unions, through picket lines, as we're seeing right now, through all the incredible actions being taken by unions. So I think activism as a term is a really broad term, and my activism and my journey throughout activism has been one very much in learning and kind of linking up with generations that have come before me and the generations that are coming in after me, and kind of learning from people in all spaces. And often people would be a little bit shy about calling themselves activists, particularly those in academic spaces. But I feel like a lot of the statistics and the data that they give us really are the tools that we can use as activists when we're campaigning on the street. So yeah, my journey from police officer to someone who often stands outside police stations with a megaphone is not really one that many people have been on, but it's one that I'm really, really proud of, and, you know, I wear that kind of badge of being an activist with extreme pride.
Thank you, Chantelle. That's a really fascinating story, and the interaction, obviously, with your experience as a police officer and being in that space, speaking out against sexism and racism as obviously a very politicizing moment. And I think it's interesting talking about activism and what it is to be an activist, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to be doing what a lot of people associate with activism, which is to sort of stand outside a building with a megaphone, as you described. But activism can sometimes change what is the most powerful room to be in, what's the most powerful tactic to use, can sort of vary according to the needs of the situation. So I'd like to move on to Clare, and if Clare could explain the story as well, about and how you became to be an activist, and what your relationship is with the term.
Yeah, thanks. I was on a panel the other day with somebody who said, like, who was asked a similar question, can you say what activism is? And she said a really simple and useful response, I think, which was like, it's just doing something that you're good at, using your skills that you know that you've got to address something that you're enraged by. And there are plenty of things wrong in the world, aren't there, that we think should be different. And so applying your skill set to that in whatever way that you find that's possible and the most effective, I think, is kind of an easy definition of activism that helps us to understand that it's far more about the intention than the presence always being the same thing. I totally agree with what's been said already. I mean, my journey towards the place where I am today probably, you know, in fairness, begins with like being a teenager and learning about the hole in the ozone layer, and learning that the adults, whoever they are, have known about this, you know, science that CFCs are going to break down the hole in the ozone layer since like the 1970s. And I was at school in the 90s going like, well, how come it's in hairspray then? How come it's still in consumer products? And how can you, in all honesty, kind of organize business and society and politics ignoring the best possible available information about the impact of a product or a material? And so, you know, I think that had quite a big impact on me as a young person. And then I went into the fashion industry and I started to work, you know, think about sustainability. And I wrote a dissertation about that when I was at university, which I was also told by my lecturers was like unimportant, not sexy, nobody cares about it. If you can't see it, nobody's going to ever care. And I think around that time, I started putting up information around the studio about, you know, what was really going on in the wool industry, or how many thousands of people all over the world are poisoned to death by working on cotton farms with inappropriate protection, and don't understand the poisonous danger that the chemicals that they're using pose to them. And, you know, in a way that was kind of me beginning to do activism in the fashion studios, against the kind of spirit of the lecturers that was saying, oh, it's not really important, no one cares. I then went and worked in the commercial fashion sector, and then also ran like small brands that did ethical and sustainable work, including like upcycling and sustainable produced women's technical cycle wear. But what's always been clear to me is that, you know, you can try to do some good around the edges by doing business better, by making clothes in a different way, by trying to redefine what it is to run a business or a clothing brand or whatever. But it's fundamentally the rules of the economy and of society at large that have to change, and no amount of sustainable clothing is going to really do anything about that. And now, having seen the expansion of just my sector, the clothing sector, we're producing 100 billion garments a year on this little planet of ours. And, you know, that's an extraordinary number when you consider how many people there are, and when you consider how how impoverished the majority of people on the planet are. So for people to be shopping at that kind of a rate, you know, you would need an awful lot more people, and you'd need an awful lot more wealthy people. So it doesn't make any sense, and the expansion just wants to carry on and on and on. So for me, it sort of feels like, although it's an absurd proposition to say, well, I didn't manage to fix the fashion industry, so let's go and try and change the whole of society instead. But in a way, you know, that's the journey that I've been on, through sort of recognizing that the sustainability paradigm is just bollocks. It's not going to work because it's couched in a system that won't actually facilitate the changes that the people who are working on sustainability to be successful in making. And obviously, with the dawn of sort of, you know, setting up Extinction Rebellion, I'd done activism in the past where we, you know, did interesting things, let's say, in public spaces and stuff, mostly sort of with a group that was based on the situationist art movement called the Space Hijackers. But it was never as pointed as what we've been doing for the last few years. So, you know, it's been a really interesting journey towards undertaking far more kind of strategic and higher personal cost non-violent civil disobedience and direct action tactics. And yeah, here we are today, I guess.
Thank you, Claire. No, I think there's something about kind of a clarity of sort of moral thought and justice and an understanding of justice that happens when you're at a younger age, and certainly with the kind of understanding the climate issues in the 1990s, but at the same time seeing the complete sort of lack of any kind of meaningful action to that. There's a kind of clarity of focus in terms of understanding the injustice there. And I think it also, one of the things you say throughout your activism career, as it were, being always engaged in practice, I think is extremely important. So, you know, activism is something that you do rather than something that is necessarily just a kind of a tag or a label. So thank you for that. And moving on to Sarah. So I guess the same questions for you, and how you feel about this this tag and label of activism.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I really agree with a lot of what Chantelle and Claire have already said about, you know, what activism is and how a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily call themselves activists probably are taking part in activism, even if they don't necessarily recognise it as that. And I think activism has a much broader definition than just maybe the traditional way of thinking of it, of you know, maybe taking to the streets and going on a march. I think it goes beyond that to basically just not standing for the status quo, not accepting the status quo, and doing something to bring about change. And that can look really different depending on who you are or what background you come from, or maybe what the issue is. And we're seeing more and more of that come to the fore. There's a movement called the craftivist movement, which people might have heard of before, and that was started up by someone called Sarah, who is an introvert and kind of didn't see herself sort of fitting in the usual kind of more extroverted ways of doing activism. So started inviting people to do crafts and things, and then send them to politicians as a way of trying to influence them and change their views on things, which I think is a really nice example of that kind of expanding definition. And some people have even started talking about rest as a form of activism as well, and as a, you know, radical thing to kind of stand against our modern day culture of kind of hustle and hurry. And there's something called the Rest of Activism, which promotes that, and also the NAP Ministry, if anyone has come across either of those things, which, yeah, I think is really interesting. And in terms of how I came to activism. So my it was very much through climate change and through my interest in that, and my background is in environmental psychology. So I did psychology at university, and was really interested in the psychology of why people might know that something like climate change is happening, but not be sort of driven to action. Because I think those of us who can't really understand that. Why could anyone know about it and not be doing everything in their power to change that? And there are so many kind of reasons as to why that might be, and why we've known about it for such a long time. And we're still finding ourselves in the situation that we are today. But it was through that I started getting more involved in kind of engaging politically, and kind of through my work at Hope for the Future, who I've been with for about 8 years now. I encountered the power of individuals having conversations with politicians, and how that can lead to change, and how powerful that can be, and how we as individuals do have power within us to make change, and how exciting that is, and wanting to share that with more and more people, and particularly with social justice issues, things like climate change, racial injustice, all of these kind of social injustices. It's so important that change does happen at a systemic level. And with climate change, I think for a long time, the onus has been put on individuals and individual change, but actually we need to be seeing change at a systemic level, and at a political level, to see the level of change that we need to see in order to tackle the climate and nature crises. So I think for me, climate change was my route into activism, and the way I do activism probably looks very different to the way other people do. But I think the key thing is that everyone has the ability and the power to make change.
Thank you, Sarah. I think it's very interesting what you say about the sort of the kind of psychological effects of climate change, and the way in which we can feel very easily a sense of powerlessness, or when we feel compelled to do something, or we feel that there is a recognition of the need to do something, but we have certain kind of ways of emotionally protecting ourselves from the kind of true realities of these issues, to sort of protect ourselves emotionally. But I think we've seen a kind of great moment of agency and visibility in recent years with the work that XR in particular has sort of helped initiate, and it's initiated a kind of scale shift, I think. And the same, of course, is true for anti-racist groups, particularly in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd in 2020. So my next question really is, as someone who does research on social movements, it seems that activists often have to make strategic decisions to frame a movement in a way that will enable it to gain traction and visibility. But that traction and visibility can then generate greater scrutiny in terms of the movement's representation, democracy. So my question, and perhaps we'll start with Claire this time. So for groups and movements that you're involved with, what challenges do you face in ensuring that they are inclusive and democratic?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Well, it's a really difficult thing to achieve, I think. Having often we can find places where you might have far more representation of people who are, you know, part of different communities or groups of people who are more often marginalized in society than you can see in XR. And we've been very criticized for, you know, not enabling as many people from as many of those most often marginalized communities to come into the fold. I think, you know, what we're doing in this April is an attempt to make a space with which people can understand has a much broader invite. And so far it's looking like relatively successful. We'll share a link at the end to the website where we've got a big number ticking, you know, sign-ups, people saying that they're going to come and show up on the 21st of April for 4 days. You know, that space is going to be quite different to the spaces that we've held in the past, because the focus has been on coalition building and relationship building and bringing a broader base and making a broader base more visible. But it really has been challenging that if you think that it's going to be effective to undertake, you know, direct actions which will lead to arrest and likely criminalization of the participants, obviously that's not an easy thing for some people to do for like many different reasons. That said, I do think you know, the climate and the ecological kind of space, the green movement at large, you know, XR isn't exceptional in coming under a lot of scrutiny for a lack of diversity. The environmental third sector, the big ENGOs, come under a lot of fire for that. Historically, the green movement has been very white. You know, people have a lot of ideas about what that might be down to, from, you know, saying, well, if you can't be certain how you're putting the next meal on the table, you're certainly not worrying about something that feels like it's far in the future or abstract or distant from your like day-to-day struggles. So there's often a sort of tension that people say they think is present for people to, you know, in order to be able to see what to focus on. And I certainly know disabled activists who work with Extinction Rebellion who feel concerned and get some criticism from their own community for focusing on this other thing that's not the needs of their own community, that are more immediate and more pressing for them. So it's a real challenge, I think, particularly if you're talking about something as sort of big and universal as the climate, because we are pushing for a universal good, and we did try to set up a movement that was welcoming to political diversity. So that's also really challenging, because if you say you're really welcome to come and join XR, even if you're a conservative, even if you're a Liberal Democrat, even if you're a person who works in the city, even if you're you might find all sorts of people in a movement that says that it's designed to be wide open and non-partisan. And that's also really challenging. How can people sort of coexist when there are obviously difficult conversations to be had off the back of that? I would recommend, if people are interested in sort of looking at structures of movements and stuff, to do some research into you know, organizational structure design. We've run an experiment in XR with what we call the self-organizing system, and it's loosely based on a form of holacracy, which is a mode of developing a system where you have, it's certainly quite horizontalist, but it has the capacity for these verticals. You can have coordinators who are elected, who lead on things, who in theory can drive things forwards. And those people are trusted by a team to be their coordinators. And if you don't like them, you can all vote to bin them off and get a different one. But because it works in such a different way to the sort of standard hierarchical, classical organizational structure, I think often people forget how to use the dynamics and the way that it's been designed. which can be quite challenging because we're sort of working in a different way. And then on top of it all, you've got this issue of voluntarism and people not earning very much money or not earning any money from it. So it's hard then as well to guarantee accountability through a system where we're sort of used to having accountability. Like if you don't do your job, you get sacked and then you don't get paid. So then you have that incentive. We don't work with those kinds of incentives. So it's a complicated space in some ways because we're not working in the same way as we do in the rest of the real world, if you see what I mean, when we organize together in movements. And I didn't know anything about designing an organization from scratch when we started XR. There were other people who had that knowledge and interest already. And I would say my experience of going through this process over the last 5 years has been like a learning curve that's practically a straight line in terms of working out sort of, what works and what doesn't work and how much we've learned from trialing it all out. And on top of this kind of holacratic system that I've just described, which is kind of an experiment in self-organizing systems, we've also got a decentralized structure where people have autonomy to do things, as long as they stick to our principles and values and the guidelines, they can go off and make a flag and go and do their own thing. You don't have to sign up or put your name in anywhere or pay or, be an official member of anything. So it's also has an added complexity that it's almost like two system designs that work together and often rub up against each other and bump into each other in quite uncomfortable ways from time to time. So yeah, I could go on, but it probably would get quite boring. So maybe I'll leave it at that. Hopefully it makes some sense.
Thank you, Claire. That's a really insightful answer. Sarah, what are your thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, so I think we all know that those who will be most affected by the effects of climate change are those who are most marginalised from society. And yeah, as Claire has been saying, the environment movement has historically been very undiverse, if that's the right word for it, very homogenous, very white middle class. And it's also true that marginalised communities are also the least likely to have their voices heard in political systems. So even though these communities have contributed the least to the problem, are set to be the worst affected and aren't having their voices heard in making the changes that we need to see to combat the issue. And a lot of marginalised groups are the most likely to be disillusioned by the political system as well. And a few surveys have found that, for example, 77% of ethnic minority adults would say that their level of satisfaction with politics is very low. People with disabilities are less likely to engage with politics and have lower trust in politicians and the political system. And young people as well are also less likely to say that democracy serves them well, and to think that our political system actually operates badly. But these people need, these communities need to be involved in how we do make change, and the change that we do see in order to tackle these issues. And climate change is such an intersectional issue, and affects so many different aspects of our lives, and also exacerbates existing social inequalities as well. It's so important that these voices are heard in coming up with the solutions that we need. And I think one of the ways in which we do this is by creating space, safe space for these communities to basically come and have their say, and not expecting them to kind of fit into a system or a way of doing things that doesn't necessarily work for them. And one example of a way that Hope for the Future's worked with a group in this way was recently we worked with a Bangladeshi women's group in Oldham who wanted to do something about the fact that the air pollution in the local area was affecting their children and having an impact on their children's health. But they didn't feel comfortable to be engaging with their local MP. They didn't want to be kind of engaging on that kind of government level. So we worked with them with their local council instead to engage them on air pollution, and had a fantastic event where we kind of celebrated the kind of Bangladeshi culture. I know Aaron, who introduced the event today, was there at the event, and the deputy leader of the council was there, and also their head of finance, who agreed to continue the conversations about air pollution and look into ways to reduce air pollution in the local area, which is just fantastic that they were able to kind of engage in that way, and have the main concerns that they were worried about voiced to the people who do have the power and are able to pull the right levers to make that change. And I think as well, politicians want to hear from a diverse range of constituents, and for so long they hear from kind of the same people, and climate change can be seen as something that only matters to a certain demographic of people. But we know that that's not true, and that the best way that they will be influenced is if they're hearing from a broad range of their constituents. And yeah, that's the best way that we can make change.
Thank you, Sarah. Moving on to Chantelle, do you see that there is, have you seen opportunities, and do you feel optimistic about bridging the environmental movement and the anti-racist activism that you've been involved in? Because of course we know that environmental racism is very much a thing.
Yeah, I think kind of environmental activism and civil rights activism are, there is intersectionality there. And I think sometimes as a civil rights activist, you'll be in environmental spaces and people will kind of look like, are you not under the banner of civil rights and BLM? And for me, to be a civil rights activist and to be someone who is saying that Black Lives Matter is to be someone who is very much fighting for our planet too, and is very much a part of the environmental movement, because we know that global south people are some of the worst impacted by the environmental emergency, and even in the UK, Black and global majority people are some of the worst impacted. Black people are 3 times more likely to live with high levels of CO2, 3 times more likely to have respiratory problems, and more likely to kind of be on the front line in terms of where places like incinerators, highways, airport runways are built, because the powers that be tend to see diverse communities as having less of a voice, and not really being able to kick up as much of a fuss as if they were to put these kinds of developments in white middle class areas. So it's really important to ensure that movements are quite intersectional, but there are inherent challenges there. In terms of, global majority people feeling confident in entering climate justice spaces, just because aesthetic-wise, they don't always look like spaces where we'll be welcome. And then obviously the people who have had negative experiences within those spaces. So that kind of, that hesitance is rooted in lived experience, and also in being a little bit cautious around in those mainstream spaces. But climate justice spaces really do need to be inclusive and kind of need to make that space. And if I'm honest, I am seeing that shift. I've seen that shift more recently. I myself work with XR, Just Stop Oil, Tipping Point, a number of environmental organisations, and in Merseyside we do lead on not only delivering workshops around decolonising environmental spaces and climate justice spaces, but also on building confidence within our own communities for people of colour to feel empowered, because a lot of people, you know, the kids have got asthma, there's this big building being built up where they live and they want to fight about it, but then when they go into the nearest climate justice group, they're not really seeing themselves within that space. So it's kind of to empower people to be in those spaces. But in terms of challenges to democracy and challenges to inclusivity, I think civil rights movements are inherently quite democratic, with BLM just being the next wave of a civil rights movement that spans generations or more. Quite often, as Sarah had mentioned, because there's often not as much inclusion, and some of the same issues faced for people of colour in relation to climate justice spaces can also be applied to political spaces. And I'm talking about politics with a big P, so, you know, mainstream political spaces, the big parties. And so there's that feeling of not having access to democratic spaces, which is why you often see a lot of brilliant activism within the civil rights movement, but it's on the street, and you won't see a lot of the activists that you see involved in street campaigns in actual mainstream political spaces, even though, you know, street spaces are political. So I think when we think about political spaces, we do really need to fight for those politics with a small p, street spaces for people to engage in activism. And it's no coincidence that in 2020, the year when both BLM and Extinction Rebellion really mobilised huge groups of people that often intersected for the first time in generations, got them out on the streets in a real democratic way, that the government came back to us with the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which was passed and became the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, which massively diminished some of our rights to have that democratic voice. But then, as if that wasn't enough, came with the Public Order Bill, which is going, you know, running through Parliament at the moment. So we really need to look at that governmental response and how our voices and how our democratic, you know, our rights to freedom of speech should really be diminished in some of the spaces that people of colour have access to because of the reasons I've mentioned before. And I kind of think in relation to the democratic structure of the, you know, BLM and civil rights movements, I think a lot of criticisms and levels of BLM, but in the same way as Claire mentioned before about XR, these are quite decentralised structures, so anyone can kind of, if they've got the right ethos and moral direction, can set up a bill. There's no powers that be that you have to consult with, and that's why you have a lot of local groups with their own personalities, their own structure. But then a lot of the criticism that is levelled at BLM is levelled because of either things going on in America or things that have happened with organisations that aren't necessarily connected to one another. So I think within civil rights movements, a lot of us, especially us in Merseyside, have really established who we are locally. So people know who we are, people know what we're about, and kind of it's important for people to understand that we often all operate as autonomous groups. And in relation to, you know, us being really open and transparent, whenever we fundraise, we literally post every receipt online. We post everything that we've spent every penny on online. We get a tiny amount of funding. And for most of our meetings, we will literally put it out to all of the people who follow us. We'll put it out really out in the open because we want people to be part of our movement. And we want people to engage. So we have like a real open door policy of, listen, if you want to be part of the movement and you want to support us, please engage. But I do think in terms of inclusivity, this wave of the civil rights movement, and this will be my last point, has been one of the most diverse waves in terms of civil rights has always been an inclusive space, but our allies haven't always been there. You know, we sometimes if you saw white people, it was white people who were part of communities who had links to Black communities and who really kind of had a foot on the door. And I think what has happened with this with the civil rights movement is our allies have been up and seen what our lived reality was and come along with us. Some of our biggest allies being from the LGBTQ plus community, and they've really stuck with us and supported us throughout this journey. So in Liverpool, we have a very intersectional approach, and while we often, you know, BLM will be looking at civil rights issues and around the experiences of people of colour. We intersect with groups like Reclaim Pride Liverpool, which I'm one of the co-founders of, Merseyside Pensioners, United We Stand, lots of other groups that kind of campaign around other issues, but we all support each other. And then when there's a big cause, be it climate justice, be it, the arms fair that happened last year, be it, things that are happening in the city, like the far right riot that happened a few months ago, we're all there to support each other. We'll all come together and we'll all kind of get out there on the street. So I think that we do need to really embed intersectionality within our movements, and we kind of need to build the movements that we need and retain that kind of inclusivity and that structure going forward. So I think it's about the changes that we're making going forward that we really need to focus on.
Thank you, Chantelle. I'm really pleased to see the ways in which those movements are intersecting and listening to each other. We are starting to run out of time, so I'm going to my final topic, I'm going to plug to the question that we've received from a member of the audience. So in terms of taking this forward, we obviously have seen these kind of moments of great agency, but how do we sustain and grow movement work to ensure that the aims and purpose of our movements are embedded institutionally, rather than a council declaring a climate emergency and then doing nothing, or a politician taking the knee and then doing nothing? How do we actually take this forward so it is embedded in what institutions and structures are able to achieve, but also for us as individuals? So if we do feel helpless, what are some of the small steps that we can start to take in order to feel like we are enacting meaningful change? So we'll start with Sarah.
Thanks, Alex. Sorry, I couldn't quite reach my unmute button. Great. So yeah, 2 questions I think there around how we embed this change into institutions so that it's not just a kind of one-off a one-off thing that's maybe a bit what's the word, doing it for demonstration but not actually meaning anything. And then I think there was a question about people who feel like they have no individual power, the small steps they can start to make. So I think on the first question, it's really important because we see so much greenwashing within for climate change that it needs to be more than someone just saying that they're going to do one thing, or just a council declaring a climate emergency and then not actually doing anything about it. And I think there's a few things. One that's perhaps a bit obvious is actually following up. So looking at the Hope for the Future perspective on things, we work with groups and individuals to engage with MPs, councillors, other politicians to take action on climate change. And our approach is very much about the longer term engagement and actually building relationships with those politicians to kind of take action together on these issues. So we always would tell constituents to be following up with their politicians that they've engaged with on whatever it is that they've asked them to do. For example, a constituent might send a letter to an MP to ask them to sign up to a petition or something like that. But then they might go and meet with them to take that a bit further and ask them if they would maybe come to an event and speak about that and why they signed it. And then, taking that even further. So I think just, continually following up, and this is obviously very specific to working with individual politicians or councils, but just continually holding them to account and building on the work that you've already done. Because if you can ask them to do one thing that's fairly small, like signing a petition, if they've done that and seen how easy that was, how harmless that was, then you can ask them to do something bigger next time. But I also think it's about culture change and also individual belief change as well. You know, we have seen we've seen many culture shifts over the last few years, but again, specifically on climate change, you know, back in 2017-18, when Hope for the Future was kind of first gaining traction, you wouldn't get a Conservative MP saying the words climate change in Parliament. And in fact, we even had a Conservative MP say to us once, "I'll do what you want me to do on climate change, just don't make me say the words climate change," which just shows, you know, what it was like back then with the culture. Whereas, you know, these days that's not so much of an issue. And although, you know, we still need them to be taking a lot more action than they currently are, it's not a case of Conservative MPs being scared to talk about it, at least in Parliament. And also change on an individual level in terms of you know, getting your politician to see that their constituents do care about this issue and that it's something that is of high value to them, and therefore it should be high value to the politician as well. And then I think your second question was around kind of individuals feeling as though they have power, and I think this is something where you can start really small and then kind of build up to maybe bigger actions, such as even engaging with a politician can, you know, that can seem like quite a big daunting thing, but maybe just starting where you are, and maybe even just making changes within your house and, you know, making your family make changes, whether that's getting them all to recycle or changing to a renewable energy supplier. And then you could look more broadly to your community or the street that you live on, and, you know, whether you could start up a kind of a repair scheme or a swap scheme so that there's less waste. And then maybe looking to your local council to make change, and, you know, whether they could be piloting different projects or making policy change within the whole local area to benefit the whole community, and then maybe looking to engage with your MP or you know, MSP or assembly member, again to just make that change even more broadly. But I also think doing these things in community is really important, and I think if you're being an activist on your own, that can feel really, really isolating. So it's really important to go along to things like marches, like the big one, the XR are organising, or the Great Big Green Week is organised by the Climate Coalition. Just being in community with others who are all also calling for the same thing, I think is really important, because it shows you that you're not on your own, and that you know, more voices can make a much bigger change as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Very wise words and advice. Chantelle, hoping that the commotion in the cafe has subsided, but if you have some thoughts to these questions.
Hi, yeah, sorry, there was a little bit of a kerfuffle in the cafe earlier, but it seems to have settled down. But I think in terms of embedding changes into institutions, you often get institutions who, you know, they want to greenwash or they want to appear to be changing the policies and the practice, but it's literally just a superficial kind of veneer, just so they're in line with what they see as a current trend, rather than an urgent need for, you know, cultures, policies, practices to shift in order to change, you know, the trajectory that we're on. And I think that there's also organisations who do want to change, but they maybe don't have all of the tools and the support network that they need. And I think that's where you kind of want to start, in terms of giving them the knowledge, the tools, the support that they need. But then also, quite often when we work with organisations, they'll want us to maybe deliberate training or do something with staff, and then it's just a one-off. But we really encourage them to do a check-in with us within 3 months, do a check-in within 6 months, and then continue to have that, you know, communication. So we can sort of see where they're at, and it also remains at the forefront of their mind to embed change, especially when it's around decolonial work, which often goes hand in hand with what we're experiencing in terms of the climate at the moment. It's part of the colonial legacy, part of the legacy of what capitalism is doing to the world right now. So I think that's one of the ways that we can embed it at an institutional level. But then I also think that, and this is where politics comes into it, we need the political backup too. So, you know, in relation to technological development across the African continent, specifically in West Africa, we need real fines that actually mean something to these big corporations. So quite often we look at the fines and, you know, it's tens, maybe hundreds of thousands, and it looks like quite a big number. But these are organizations that are making tens and hundreds of thousands every couple of minutes or every few seconds. So we actually need fines that make them scared and make them want to, you know, actually recycle waste or commit to not creating goods that fall apart within 5 minutes. So you have to replace them constantly and stop, you know, propping up this consumer culture and this hamster wheel of constantly buying more and more and more, which obviously fills up landfills. I think we also need to consider fair trade policies and not this continuing exploitation of the global south, which is another key pillars of the climate emergency, whether it be in fashion industry or in the food production industry. But then we also need to consider, you know, the damage that was caused through politics. I always remember famously David Cameron's pledge to ditch the DEF, which ended onshore wind projects, cut solar subsidies, and also cut energy efficiency standards, which lost homes and, you know, average householders around £150, but also the planet lost out massively. And if we think if those policies were kind of reversed, so that energy efficiency was a priority, so that we were embedding road plans and so that, you know, pedestrians and bicycles were prioritised, and we were really changing that culture at an organisation and an institutional level, because, you know, politics is an institution, political spaces are institutional spaces, and they hold the biggest punching power. So I think that we really need to sort of show our teeth a little bit in terms of having real consequences when organisations are failing, and then holding up examples of betters and potentially giving more trade to organisations that are actually doing well. And as a consumer, we can do that too. So, you know, these super corporate organisations who are failing on every level, well, let's not buy there anymore. Let's go somewhere else. Let's go to ethical traders. Let's go to fair traders. Let's go to organisations that actually embed, you know, positive steps within their policies, practices and structures. And I think the other question was how we empower individuals who want to get engaged in climate justice activism. I think it can be quite into environmental activism at the moment, because it's huge, you know, and it can feel really overwhelming. It can feel like we're hurtling towards this, you know, this really, really terrifying point. But I do think that's why you should, if you can, link up with groups that are already established, link up with national groups, link up with local groups, get on social media and find out what's happening in your area or nationally, because A, you get that community support, B, Sarah touched upon, you're less likely to burn out and you're more likely to be in this position where you can get that rest because there's other people within the movement who can, you know, pick it up. Because as activists, we have peaks and troughs in terms of our energy levels. We have times when we need to take a step back, and there's times when we can really push. And when you're connected to a network and when you've got support, you're really in a place to do that. And also when you're having a little moment where you're like, oh, you know, they've just passed another law, which is destroying the planet, you sort of have your community to hold you up and to offer you that support. So I'd say absolutely bring that passion in, find what's already going on, and I guarantee there will be an organisation that will be absolutely amazing to have you as part of, you know, the campaign, as part of the continued fight against the climate crisis, because we need everyone on board, and we need, as we've spoken about, anyone can be an activist. There's so many different skills that are needed, whether it's backstage or front stage, and yeah, now's the time to get involved. We really are. in my opinion, in the end game. And it's just like anyone who can get involved, do get involved. And we'll all welcome you with open arms and we'd love to support you with that.
Thank you very much, Chantelle. And finally, Claire.
Yeah, thanks. Well, so in terms of getting things to actually change rather than slowing them down, I think we do have to be very focused on our strategies for not only landing the right message in the right way, but also thinking really carefully about whether we're advocating for something which is enough. Because, you know, as Chantelle said, we are, you know, I find it remarkable to look at how few people actually show up to things, you know, historically to do with the climate, when we are so very clearly now in what people are terming the end game. I think it's important in terms of the impact to think about something of that we learned from doing XR was in the beginning when we came out with this you know, demand that said net zero by 2025. This is appropriate given our historic responsibilities. We're globally rich. We've stolen lots of money and lots of wealth from people all over the world. That's made us capable of churning out this vast amount of carbon contribution to the climate, to damaging the climate. So we came out with this 2025, and I think that was, you know, most people were talking either about 2050 from the government or in the NGO sector of 2045, 2040, don't want to ruffle too many feathers. It's important to bear in mind that if you go into a negotiation, you do not ask for what you actually want, because you're not going to get that. You're going to get half of it. So you have to ask for things that are radically you know, serious in terms of dealing with this crisis, on the understanding that if you will only get a bit of what you're asking for, don't ask for something realistic. So when we said 2025, I think a lot of people think that really influenced the Labour Party, for example, when they came forward and said, actually, we think 2030 is a reasonable and responsible date. So you may or may not know that there's a campaign at the moment on by an organisation called the Sortition Foundation, and we know them quite well in various parts of XR. And their campaign is to replace the House of Lords with a Chamber of Citizens, which would be organised based on sortition. So it's a random selection process, like a jury process, like a lottery process, in order to select ordinary citizens to go and make a representative body that would sit in that chamber instead of the unelected lords that we have at the moment. And what's interesting, I think, about looking at campaigns of that nature and the call for citizens' assemblies by Extinction Rebellion is that it's asking for a systemically different way of doing politics, a different set of people making decisions in a different way. So at the moment, we have a political system which is combative, it's oppositional, it's embarrassing, quite frankly, most of the time, but it certainly doesn't allow for a mature conversation about difficult topics. And I've heard people say things like, you know, Boris Johnson was famous for being able to start a debate on one side and switch to the opposite side during the debate and still win. So, you know, it's based on being able to win arguments. It's not a system which is based on having like deep, mature, complex discussions in order to reach resolution, which is what deliberative democratic processes do. So if a citizens' assembly is called to deal with serious issues in society, then people from many, many different parts of society sit around these tables and they'll say, well, what should be done? And what is the most just response? What is the most socially fair thing that we could do in terms of policy? And so it helps us as a conversation about a transformational approach to doing politics in a more democratic way, in a more inclusive and a more representative way, to me is a natural, easy place to say, and that would get you more representation of people of colour, and that would get you more representation of people with disabilities, and the list goes on. You would have gender balance. So even that, you'd have a chamber which is probably a 50% female. You're very, very far away from achieving that in this country at the rate of change that's taking place in terms of, like, you know, the incremental increase in female representation in politics. So we know that joining up all these dots would be an easy thing to do if we could understand that politics is possible to be done differently. And I think, you know, it would also be easy to have a conversation then about, well, you know, climate is a health crisis as well as a social justice crisis, as well as an environmental crisis. We would be able to see people come together across their differences and find common ground. You may have noticed recently that everybody is incensed about the raw sewage that's being pumped into our rivers and into our oceans. I was talking about this last night with some people. I think it's because that's our commons. We don't have any commons in this country, hardly, but the rivers are. Then we go, but that's my river. How dare you pump all that raw sewage into it whilst you're, you know, getting paid several £1 million a year to be the boss of a private water company. People across the political spectrum are very, very angry about that. It's a great uniting issue to try and tackle. And so I think looking at how we can do things in a way which is systemically different, looking at the way we can approach things that bring people together in order to find their commonality, understanding that democracy is an endeavor of love, and it's messy and it's difficult and it's hard work and it has to be done in an ongoing way. It's a thing you do. It's not a system that you impose and then there you go, it's done. It's an ongoing process. And also to bear in mind that we are facing breakdown and collapse, and I don't think we're as far away from that as most people probably believe. And so if we're to face the reality of the situation that we really sit in today, we should be thinking about how to popularize the ideas that are going to help us go through those times. And one of those things that I'm sort of interested to begin conversations about at the moment is the idea of a Nansen passport, or like a climate passport for people who live in a place which is becoming uninhabitable. Where exactly do we intend to invite people to move to? And there are there's the concept that came out of the post-war era where people had become stateless and they were given a special passport, and certain countries signed up to say, you can come and live here if you're stateless because we're going to accept the Nansen citizens. And we need to be urgently having these kinds of conversations, because at the moment we can see, even with the refugees that exist today, the gutter politics that is taking place around that conversation. And we know as climate campaigners and as social justice campaigners that this is going to get a lot worse very, very quickly. And our political system doesn't have a clue what to do about it, apart from make disgraceful policies and, you know, argue in the gutter about small boats and stuff like this. They're not serious about dealing with the realities of what's coming down the tracks due to the climate crisis. And so I think we can shift the conversation much more quickly than we sometimes think, as if we're effective with our activism. And we need to be very responsible about the kinds of conversations that we're priming the public and our own spaces to have, in order that we're like best prepared for what's coming down the tracks.
Thank you, Claire. Powerful words, and I'm reminded of the famous situationist slogan of be realistic, demand the impossible, because it seems increasingly necessary, and the impossible may always be met halfway. So we're just over time now, so thank you so much to Claire and to Sarah and to Chantelle for their fantastic contribution to this discussion. I'm going to pass on to Johnny, who's going to wrap up for us.
Thanks, Alex. Fantastic job hosting this evening. Really appreciate that. And just to say yet another thank you to all of our panelists this evening for such fascinating insights and thought-provoking questions for us to all take away. And as has been discussed, this is very much a journey that we're all on together, and hopefully this event is part of that journey and bringing people together. So do keep talking to each other, because we only solve these really hard, complex and seemingly impossible problems by working together to unpick them and find ways forward. As I mentioned at the start, this is the first day of the Festival of Debate. So if you go to festivalofdebate.com, you can see the full lineup for the next 5 or 6 weeks. If you are out and about in Sheffield and across South Yorkshire, you can also grab one of these, which is this year's festival brochure with the lovely George Law designed front cover. But that is, as Alex said, everything we have for this evening. So thank you so much for joining us. If you do have the ability to donate to keep and help support the festival, please do so, which you can do so from the website. But otherwise, enjoy the rest of your evenings, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.